It is not my intention to cause a bunch of panic across Cougar Nation, but the simple fact of the matter is if BYU men's basketball has aspirations of playing in March Madness next month, it all hinges on tonight's game.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And more importantly, thank you to all of you who we like to call our everydayers right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Coming up on today's show, we preview tonight's matchup against West Virginia and why it's so pivotal to BYU's postseason aspirations. Then we will talk about one of the biggest storylines heading into spring camp for BYU, backup quarterbacks. Get ready. And then we'll also finish up today's show with some new legislation being introduced by the Utah legislature that could allow BYU to directly compensate their athletes for NIL purposes. All right, so starting off today's show, let's talk about the situation at hand for BYU basketball tonight. I said it in the open. Tonight's game will determine what the postseason hopes are for BYU basketball. They may sound alarmist. That may sound way too hot takey for many of you out there, but all you got to simply do is look at the schedule remaining for BYU basketball. I think it's pretty clear why tonight's game is a pivotal matchup for Kevin Young and company. Simply put, if BYU can beat West Virginia on the road, that's a quality win A, it's a Q1 win B, and I guess number 3, it would show this BYU team has still got fight and it's still got hopes of playing in the big dance come next month. If they lose this game, they could lose this one in the same fashion they lost to Cincinnati. In many respects, that would signal that this team is going to fall down the stretch and probably is gunning for an NIT bid at the very best. You look at the remaining games for BYU, they have a double dip with West Virginia, so that's obviously a big deal. You have the season finale against Utah, which is by far your easiest remaining game. But after this game against West Virginia tonight, you come home and face off against Kansas State, who may be the single hottest team. I know the record's not immaculate right now in terms of overall record, but they've won 5 straight games, and they will be gunning, and it should be 6 straight after they beat Utah. They will be gunning to down BYU and looking to do it in pretty impressive fashion. And then, oh, by the way, following that, you have the vaunted Kansas Jayhawks coming to Provo. Now, Kansas is not what they have been in previous years, and that looks like a game you could win at home. But I'm telling you, you lose to West Virginia, and the path to a 10-10, potentially an 11-9 conference record that Ken Pomeroy said it at the outset of conference play for BYU, that's what it would take at minimum for BYU to make the NCAA tournament. You lose this game tonight against the West Virginia Mountaineers, and it sure looks like it could be a very perilous stretch for BYU to navigate. At best case scenario, and most projections out there, BYU is projected to go 4-4 down the stretch. They have 4 games that they're favored in, according to BPI, the Basketball Percentages Index, as well as KenPom.com. A big tip of the cap to Jackson Payne from the Deseret News for doing a lot of the legwork on this. I was reading his piece, and both projections from KenPom.com and ESPN's BPI indicate BYU, best case scenario, goes 4-4 down the stretch, finishes 10-10 in conference record. And that's right on the cusp of getting you into the NCAA tournament. And it would all hinge upon what quality wins you've collected down the road. If you beat the likes of West Virginia on the road, that's a quality W. But tonight, it's no small task because West Virginia is very good. They have one of the best players and a guy who absolutely torched BYU a season ago in Javon Small leading their lineup. Now, his last name may be Small, but Javon is anything but small. This is a guy, remember last year, was at 34 points that he scored, and at the time he was playing for Oklahoma State, and with the upheaval there in Stillwater, he ultimately entered the transfer portal and landed at West Virginia, and he has been on an absolute tear all season long for the Mountaineers. He's averaging a shade under 19 points per game, but in any given contest, he feels like a guy who could go for 30-plus and make life miserable for you as an opponent. West Virginia beat Utah this past weekend, and he played more of a facilitator role, had 14 points on just 5 shots. That's efficient right there. That's getting to the free throw line and getting points that way. But he also dished out 8 assists. So when you target him, he's shown he's capable of setting his teammates up. this is going to be a tough game for Kevin Young and company. This team, Jaeger Demon, Dallin Hall, Fousseyni Traore, Keva Keita, Richie Saunders, just to name a handful of guys, it's gut check time for this BYU basketball team. Losing in the fashion they lost to Cincinnati, that was a dispiriting finish for BYU. A 22-2 run at 1.18-0 to open the second half, and it was out of control at that point, and BYU simply couldn't find their way back into that contest in any way, shape, or form. Could we see some lineup adjustments tonight? Kevin Young said it yesterday that guys like Trey Stewart, Mihailo Boskovic, with their performances against Cincinnati, have reinserted themselves into the conversation to be potential guys to see extra playing time for BYU. We'll see if that comes to fruition. But simply put, if you or anybody involved with BYU basketball really has hopes of playing in the NCAA men's basketball tournament, you got to win this game tonight. It feels like if you lose this game, you essentially are losing control of any hope you have. And I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility they could go on a run down the stretch. Maybe they bounce back and beat Kansas State at home. That obviously would reignite some things. But then, like I said, Kansas, you go to Arizona. Arizona State wants nothing more than to get some payback against BYU when they face off after getting beat in Provo the way they did to open Big 12 play. Then you have another rematch against West Virginia. There are some really tough games remaining. Oh, and I forgot about Iowa State. Oh, yeah, you have to go to Ames, Iowa, by the way. So it just seems like if BYU truly has NCAA March Madness big dance aspirations, it hinges in many respects on tonight's game. And I'm interested to see how BYU responds. Kevin Young said it yesterday that he felt like he laid into his guys pretty good in their film session before they practiced out there in Morgantown ahead of tonight's game. And he said, I thought we had a really good practice. Will they respond in kind in the game? Can they withstand an inevitable run or two with the home faithful behind the Mountaineers out there in Morgantown? Can they withstand, so potentially, because we've seen that college basketball officiating just straight up sucks, can they absorb some of the inevitable bad calls that will go against them? What is the mental fortitude of this team like right now? We're going to learn tonight, and I'm fingers crossed that they pass the test. If not, could be a little tricky down the stretch for BYU, and obviously NIT could be in the calling cards versus the big dance card that BYU's hoping for come next month. All right, coming up next, we will switch over and talk a little BYU football. Big storylines for different position groups going into NCAA, BYU spring camp, that kicks off in just a couple weeks' time. It feels like it's coming early, but February 27th is when they get things underway. We'll talk about one of the biggest storylines I will be tracking in spring ball, and we'll get to that next right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Wayfair. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like getting your home a little TLC. All of us seem to want to upgrade our house, and refreshing your space helps you get back into a routine and get essentially, it's the New Year's well past us now, but get the new year off to a good start. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the new year, Wayfair has everything you need, all within your budget. The best part is there's something for every style and every home, no matter what your space is or your budget. Simply put, they want to find the right option for you guys. And also, whatever your style is, they have all different types of styles to fit exactly what you need in your space and make it feel like it's home. So give your home the refresh it needs with our friends over at Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's WAYFAIR, wayfair.com. It's obviously all sponsored by our friends at Wayfair. Every style, and of course, it's all for every home. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day whenever you hear and or watch this. My name is Jake Hatch. Just a reminder for any of you checking us out the podcast for the very first time, and had a couple of people point out, is your name Jay Catch, like Jaycatch? No, I seem to stumble through that way too often. It's Jake, Jake, Hatch, Hatch. But hey, the point still stands. I need to be a little bit better about enunciating my own name. But nonetheless, big thank you to all of you for joining us here on the podcast. All right, I had a great question submitted by our good friend David from our Locked On Cougars Insider Group, and he pointed this out. He says, Jake, I would love to hear your take on Hillstead versus Bourguet for the QB backup and heir apparent to Jake Retzloff possibilities. I've heard great things, about Treyson working hard in the offseason to make a run at it. Now, this is a great question to kick off what I'm going to call our countdown to BYU spring ball series. And the backup quarterback position for BYU, it's obviously one of interest for Cougar fans because it feels like a lot of times when the starting quarterback at BYU falters to any significant level, everybody's very quick to say, hey, put the backup in. And it could be any one of the backups through the past 50 years of BYU football. They seem at points to be the most popular man on BYU campus, even if you can't name their name. But regardless, spring camp is going to be Jake Retzloff working out with the team, but also not having to prove himself to the same levels he had to prove himself last offseason. Remember, BYU brought in Gary Bohannon to push him for QB1, and Jake won that battle and responded exactly how BYU wanted him to respond. Obviously, the same pressure will not exist after an 11-2 record. Yes, he will have to reassert himself as the alpha in that quarterback room and assert that, hey, I am the guy for BYU football. But the bigger battle to watch in the QB ranks for BYU is who is going to be his number two. McCae Hillstead, the former Utah State transfer, Springville native, played at Skyridge High School. He obviously wants to make an impression and assert himself in the pecking order. But as David points out, Treyson Bourguet, he's been making a push all off season long, and he's a transfer himself in from Western Michigan. The one thing I like about both of these guys, and they're the two chief contenders. I'm not going to absolve any other quarterback potentially from making a move, but these two guys are going to duke it out for the backup quarterback position. And the bigger point to be made is these are two quarterbacks who have got proven legitimate reps at the FBS level. Now, when I say FBS, they both were at the G5 level. McCae was a guy who was a part-time starter during his stint at Utah State, had some injuries preclude him from really asserting himself as the guy in Logan, and ultimately decided to transfer. And then a guy like Treyson Bourguet, he was a MAC Player of the Week multiple times playing for Western Michigan. So the good news, if you want to look at it this way, is if something crazy happens and Jake Retzloff is forced to the sideline for whatever reason this coming season, they will not be putting a quarterback in the game, no matter if it is Treyson or McCae, that'll be wholly unprepared and not ready to face what BYU will be facing. They have both played college football games against legitimate college football opponents. That experience is worth a lot. The other side of it is that both of them are transfers into this program. And what can they really show in spring camp that is going to separate one from the other? I fully expect this QB battle not to bury the lead, to go into training camp. But could one of them, whether it's McCae or Treyson once again, could one of them come out of spring camp with a leg up? That absolutely could be the case. Aaron Roderick and Matt Mitchell, who are the two coaches that coach up BYU's quarterbacks. Aaron obviously is the offensive coordinator, also has the formal title of QB's coach. And I would give Matt Mitchell as an offensive analyst, I would give him the assistant QB's coach title. I'd actually just call him the quarterback's coach if I had my way with BYU's labels of their coaches. But regardless, those two are going to put these guys through their paces. They will be expected to obviously take extra reps in team portions and show that they can command the huddle for the BYU offense and be that field general that Aaron Roderick requires his quarterbacks to be if they want to compete at this level. They've also got to prove that they can go up against one of the better defenses of recent memory for BYU. That linebacking core, Jack Kelly, Isaiah Glasker, Harrison Taggart, and the cavalcade of other guys behind them, as well as a fairly experienced safety group led by Tanner Wall, they're going to be very intent on making life miserable for these quarterbacks. Keanu Tanuvasa is a transfer in. He's going to want to really force the action from his defensive line spot and get pressure on the quarterback. That goes for BYU's defensive ends as well. It is going to be incumbent upon these quarterbacks, both Treyson and McCae, to show that they are poised in the pocket, they're calm under pressure, and the biggest thing is that they can make throws when the window doesn't necessarily seem to be as big as they would like it to be. This level of football, Power 4 football, means you are throwing to spots, throwing into windows that are microscopic by comparison to what some of these guys probably previously faced at previous destinations. And they've got to trust that their ability and their film study will show up in those moments to put them in positions to succeed. You turn into a turnover machine, that's a one-way ticket to seeing yourself fall behind in this race for the backup quarterback position. If you are going to be turnover prone, it stems from Kalani Sitake's time working with Kyle Whittingham. Kyle Whittingham is he's got turnover phobic in a way. You turn the ball over for Kyle Whittingham, and there's that bench over there. You go sit on it. That's really the mindset that Kyle Whittingham has for his quarterbacks. Kalani's not to the same level, but if you are a turnover-prone quarterback, Kalani's not going to trust you. Aaron Roderick's not going to trust you. Matt Mitchell, Fesi Satake, anybody who has anything to do with BYU's decision as to who their quarterback pecking order will be, you will find yourself trailing other quarterbacks if you try and force the action, force it into bad spots, and the defense comes away with turnovers. You get it stripped out. You fumble the ball at ill-timed opportunities. You're not able to move the team effectively up and down the field. Those are things that are going to stand out in spring camp. And I will obviously always admit that we see a snapshot as a media corps. We watch 15 to maybe 20 minutes of these practices that stretch an hour and a half to 2 hours. So we're seeing a snippet of it. But even in those snippets, I will be paying very close attention to how these two quarterbacks operate. I will be looking at their body language. I will be looking at how they interact with their teammates. Are they those boisterous, big-throated guys who are going to go out there and hoot and holler at everybody? Or are they kind of the quiet, confident type who will pull a guy to the side and say, hey, I know we screwed up on that route. Here's what I saw. What did you see? There are different ways to lead for every quarterback. But the nice part is, I think with Jake Retzloff leading the way for BYU, the quarterback position is in very capable hands in Provo, Utah. But if, heaven forbid, something does happen to Jake, you got to have a guy that you can trust to step into that void. And as David points out, whoever ends up being that number 2 quarterback, they have the odds-on favorite to be that heir apparent. They have time on both sides, speaking of Treyson and McCae Hillstead, multiple years of eligibility beyond this season, and they would love nothing more than to be the next quarterback to lead BYU football through their Big 12 era. It's a big, big opportunity facing both of these quarterbacks, and no offense to anybody else on the roster, it's a 2-man race for the number 2 job in Provo, and may the best man win. That, simply put, the best man has to show up and show that his body of work over the 15 practices in spring camp, and as I mentioned, I fully expect it to continue into training camp, the 20 whatever is like 29 practices they will have there. You essentially have 45 opportunities to assert yourself as the best option behind Jake Retzloff. And it's a big opportunity because, once again, it could set you up for your future as QB1 in Provo and become the guy after Jake's exits that pretty sizable chair and give you that opportunity to live your dream as a Power 4 starting quarterback competing in the Big 12 Conference. All right, coming up next, we'll finish up today's show. We'll talk about a new law that has been introduced in the Utah State Legislature that could allow BYU to put some extra money in their athletes' pockets. Now, it's related to the current situation with regards to the House settlement, but how does it differ? We'll talk about that next right here on Locked On Cougars. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for being with us. Just a reminder for you guys, if you have not done so already, please join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Find out the latest on what I'm hearing on BYU sports. For example, Jake Retzloff was at the Super Bowl this past weekend. How in the world did he end up going to New Orleans to go to the Super Bowl? Well, our Locked On Cougars Insider Group learned exactly how that came about yesterday. And the best part is those updates come to you in the form of a text message. So join us today on the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Just $5 a month to be a part of the group. But the kicker is you get 2 full weeks, 14 days before you're charged anything. So join us today on the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Link is in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us and have some fun along the path with BYU sports. All right, before we go on today's show, a new law has been introduced in the Utah State Legislature that would allow universities to directly pay college athletes for the use of their name, image, and likeness. Now, I believe it's Jordan Teuscher. It might be, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he is representing out of South Jordan. He's a Republican out of South Jordan. Said the proposal is intended to keep Utah universities competitive with schools across the country and ensure they don't fall behind because the state's laws are not up to date. Now, some of you may be aware of this, some of you may not. There has not been a real cohesive NIL bill on the docket for BYU and other Utah-based universities at all since the NIL era came about in college sports, to my knowledge. 30 other states have NIL bills on their docket, on their state books or laws. A lot of them obviously have different parameters. They require different things. They allow different athletes to do different things. And the biggest thing is, as Representative Toysher here, is that the agreement is to allow BYU and other universities in the state of Utah to directly compensate the athletes for NIL. How is that different, you're probably asking, Jake, than what we're hearing about this House settlement that is ultimately expected to pass and be implemented by the NCAA and the judge, et cetera, coming up in April? Well, it doesn't differ that much because it essentially covers the same thing. But the point that Representative Toysher, and like I said, I'm going to butcher his name, he's probably going to get corrected on this very quickly, but he points out that the question is, if for whatever reason that House settlement gets denied by the judge or something crazy happens where that NIL revenue share that the NCAA is expected to allow up to $20.5 million from universities itself to be distributed to its athletes, if that doesn't come about for whatever reason, this bill allows Utah universities to still pay their athletes and also has a provision in there to shield them for any NCAA legislation or action that would hurt these universities for directly compensating their athletes. A lot of you are probably also wondering, okay, well, are there other schools, are there other states out there that have similar laws? Yes. In fact, the state of Georgia, down in the Southeast, currently is got a proposal out there in their state legislature that NIL payments for athletes could be exempt from state income tax laws. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics of all that. That seems a little crazy to me to exempt college athletes from state income tax. But the point to be made is there's a lot out there when it comes to NIL and state legislatures getting involved. And the bigger point to be made is I appreciate the fact that the Utah state legislature is even hearing this out and trying to do something proactive for the athletes in this state. I have asked a number of representatives and state Senate people, and I don't talk to them often, but when I've had the opportunity to do so over the past 3 to 4 years since NIL came about in college sports, I have asked, hey, is there going to be any type of legislation going on the books in the state of Utah? And the answer I got every single time I asked the question was no, and I'm not aware of anything coming up. So it's cool to see this actually being brought up in the Utah state legislature. I know that there are a myriad of other things the state's legislature is tasked with doing in their 45-day legislative window. But this is something that it can absolutely benefit BYU, and it absolutely should be something that the state of Utah fully considers, and I hope that they pass it. I'm not trying to get political here, but 30 other states are trying to give their athletes a leg up when it comes to NIL. Why in the heck is the state of Utah not doing the same thing for the athletes in this state? It only enhances, it only helps, it only benefits these athletes, and more importantly, helps BYU go out there and recruit at an even higher level than they already are. We all know that BYU wants to find every type of advantage they possibly can when it comes to their recruiting. The recruiting they're going about in different ways when it comes to basketball, football, and across the board in the BYU athletic department. To have this as another, I guess, card or another facet to kind of express to athletes and say, hey, if you come here, the best part is we have state laws that allow us as a university to directly compensate you. That's awesome to see this. Now, I will also acknowledge that BYU being a private institution that's controlled by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm not fully in tune, and I'm hoping to have a Representative Toysher on my radio show, maybe get him on this podcast to explain more fully that a private university and how it would affect, as a private university, how this law would affect BYU. I would expect that there's provisions in there that would essentially say that BYU is not immune from this, but I also, at the same time, the way that BYU is operating right now in the NIL sphere, why wouldn't they embrace this? It gives them, like I said, another leg up, another advantage when it comes to recruiting. We all know that there are drawbacks when it comes to BYU's recruiting. Stringent academics, the honor code, the fact that it's a church-owned school. There are a lot of things that will be thrown in the face of BYU with negative recruiting. Why not give BYU another recruiting tool that they can use to their advantage? I'm all for this. And I hope that this gets passed by the Utah State legislature. It's intended to go into effect in May, so ahead of the NIL revenue share coming into effect. If it does by the NCAA, that's supposed to take effect July 1. So this is not having to wait too long if it does go into effect. And I hope it passes. I hope that BYU benefits from it. I hope that gives BYU, and I'll also say other universities in the state of Utah, a chance to compete on a more level playing field. We all know that college athletics, it seems more and more to be uneven in so many different circumstances. But when 30 other states have already passed similar or like-minded legislation regarding NIL and trying to give their student athletes a leg up, hey, the state of Utah, they can do BYU a solid and help them out along the way as well and give them another tool to go out there and recruit with. So I hope this passes. I hope it comes into effect, and I hope the BYU athletes cash in because they deserve it. There's billions, with a B, billions of dollars being generated on the play, the NIL of these student athletes. They deserve a sizable cut. They've deserved a sizable cut for years now. I think they said 40,000 athletes have applied for essentially back pay via that house settlement. So there's a lot of athletes hoping to cash in on this, but the future athletes as well, they want nothing more than their cut of the pie, and this could give them another piece of that pie out there. And I hope it comes to fruition and allows BYU to use it to their advantage. All right, there you go. So that's what I got for you guys on this Tuesday edition of the show. Truly do appreciate all of your guys' support. It means the world to me that you guys continue to consume this content. I do want to give a shout out to Kenny Cox, BYU Sports Information Director for football. Had me speak to his class last night. I think it's Comms 306 down at BYU. Had a great discussion about my background in media, what I kind of see the future of being. To all the students, if you're watching this podcast for the first, or in case some of you guys have been watching it or listening for multiple years, thanks for letting me come and talk to y'all. So just want to give you guys a public shout out to Kenny Cox's class. They were really, really cool. And I think the future of sports media is quite bright because they had a lot of really good questions and it made me think about a lot of different topics. And I'm still thinking about them right now. But nonetheless, as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, as always, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.